think they have a better sense of where Putin gets upset about the introduction of new weapon systems. And I think, too, it's just a realisation that the Ukrainians now have their own indigenously developed long-range strike zones that have much longer range than the ATACMS, and these have not resulted in a fundamental shift in Russia's approach to the war or escalated the situation. ATACMS is a realisation of that.
Where specifically do you think they might be used? I mean, could these be used on the Kerch Bridge, for instance?
I don't see why not. Certainly they will come with probably a couple of strings like other US weapons about strikes in Russia itself. But certainly I would see Crimea and other elements of occupied Ukraine as being very good targets for these weapon systems.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with Major General Mick Ryan. He served for 35 years in the Australian Army, commanding troops in East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also an author, strategist and keynote speaker. General Ryan, welcome to Frontline.
Thanks. Great to be with you again.
I wanted to start just by talking about the capture of Avdiivka by the Russians. I know you've been writing about this week. Just give me your key takeaways.
I think there's a couple at the tactical level. Clearly, the Russians will be able to streamline their front line in that area. And I think it gives their tactical commanders a lot of confidence. I mean, this is, I wouldn't call it a significant battlefield victory, but it is a victory. And, you know, the kind of confidence that builds can be infectious. On the other side, the Ukrainians clearly have lost a lot of people, not as many as the Russians have, but the Ukrainians can afford to lose their people less. The Russians can continue to lose people and it's not going to hurt them. The Ukrainians have shortfalls. It'll be a problem. They now will fall back on previously prepared lines. Hopefully the Russians won't be able to breach them. Politically, this is clearly an issue for Zelensky, you know, coming as it did right in the wake of the civil-military crisis between he and Zaluzhny and the appointment of General Syrskyi as the new military commander-in-chief. It looks like there are problems in the Zelensky government. I don't think that's the case, but it certainly might be interpreted that way. And clearly, Putin will be very happy about this. It gives him a nice little military victory in the lead up to the election. But, you know, I think also it just continues to solidify his position in control. If anyone had any doubts, these kind of successes just reinforce that this guy is there, he's at the top, no one's going to knock him off, and he's going to be there for a while to come yet.
And to what extent is this the Russians capturing Avdiivka? And to what extent is this the Ukrainians making a strategic decision to withdraw?
Well, either way, the Russians captured it. They now control it, and they've had a long campaign since the beginning of the war, off and on, to capture Avdiivka. They obviously stepped it up in the back half of 2023, used a lot of frontal assaults, which weren't very successful. They then adapted, moved to an operational envelopment. That worked better. And, you know, that's the acme of tactics, really, is, you know, force the adversary to do something he doesn't want to do. They forced the Ukrainians to withdraw through a mixture of envelopment and attrition, and that's what they had to do.
Is this a place where we're seeing a difference between the operational tactics of General Syrskyi compared to General Zaluzhny? I mean, if Zaluzhny was still Ukraine's military commander-in-chief, would they have tried to stay in Avdiivka for longer, do you think?
That's a counterfactual, and they're always hard to prove. I don't think so. I think the tactical situation was such that both commanders probably would have made that decision for a couple of reasons. I just think the tactical situation was different and it just wasn't defensible anymore. Secondly, Ukraine has clearly taken a political and strategic decision that force preservation trumps territory retention. I think this is a really important strategic decision, and even though Zelensky does not want to give up land, the more important resource he has is his people.
From an operational point of view, what are the challenges now for Ukraine as it withdraws from Avdiivka? How difficult is it to establish a new defensive line?
Well, I assume that, like good military commanders, they would have been preparing for this for some time. When you're in the defence, you're always preparing subsequent defensive lines, and it appears that the Ukrainians have done this. And most recently, they've really been preparing more extensive, dug-in, prefabricated defensive lines across the east and other locations in Ukraine in a way they haven't done for some time. So I think that will aid them. And being in the defence, their people shortages won't tell as much as if they were in the offence. So, Ukraine, despite its shortfalls in personnel and munitions, with good pre-prepared, laid out defensive lines, with a modicum of air and artillery and long-range fire support, should be able to hold out for some time to come.
I wanted to ask you, General, about the situation with Western military aid for Ukraine. We're obviously still waiting for this big aid package in the US to be approved by Congress. It's passed the Senate. It's being held up by Republicans in Congress at the moment. There are reports now that if it does get approved, part of it will be the US giving Ukraine long-range ATACMS missiles. They've already provided them with shorter-range ATACMS, but they'd give them the long-range ATACMS. How significant is that?
Well, there's no doubt that they'll be useful, but like every weapon in war, whether they're long or short range, fancy or not fancy, that there is no silver bullet to victory in this war. There is no wonder weapon, no single wonder weapon that is going to deliver a decisive long-term advantage to Ukraine if it's not meshed in with a range of other technologies, tactics, people, these kind of things. So it will be useful. It will allow them to reach further into Crimea with different weapon systems. I mean, when you do long-range strike, you don't just use one weapon system, you use a variety to put the enemy in a dilemma and confuse them. It will be useful, but it is not in and of itself a war-winning weapon.
And does that represent a shift in America's sort of approach here? Because previously it was speculated that part of the reason for not providing these long-range ATACMS is because they would be used in Crimea or even inside Russia, and that would be a provocation and escalate the conflict more than the Americans are comfortable with. Does the fact that they now seem willing to do that signal that the White House has changed its approach?
Well, I think for much of this war, you've seen what I'd call escalation terror in the White House. I mean, they've been terrified of any kind of new weapon system doing what they call an escalation. It was like this for HIMARS, it was like this for tanks, and it was like this for F-16s, and it's been like this for ATACMS. I think they have a better sense of where Putin gets upset about the introduction of new weapon systems. And I think, too, it's just a realisation that the Ukrainians now have their own indigenously developed long-range strike zones that have much longer range than the ATACMS, and these have not resulted in a fundamental shift in Russia's approach to the war or escalated the situation. ATACMS is a realisation of that.
Where specifically do you think they might be used? I mean, could these be used on the Kerch Bridge, for instance?
I don't see why not. Certainly they will come with probably a couple of strings like other US weapons about strikes in Russia itself, but certainly I would see Crimea and other elements of occupied Ukraine as being very good targets for these weapon systems.
And just give us a sense of the range of them. How far into Russia could they reach?
Well, it'll be several hundred kilometres, and the actual range is always classified, but several hundred kilometres if they were used in that respect. But what it would allow the Ukrainians to do is to reach into all elements of their territory that is occupied by the Russians from relatively safe zones. That's very important. It's not just how far you can reach, but you need to be able to fire and then move launch systems and the experts in it away very quickly as well. So the further away they are from the front line, the better that will be as well.
You mentioned that the White House has had escalation terror for a long time. Do you think the death of Alexei Navalny has sharpened people's minds in the West?
It's hard to tell. Certainly there was a high level of revulsion of what's happened here, what the Russian government have done to him. This notion of sudden death syndrome is cynical in the extreme and is playing with the emotions of Navalny's friends and families, if nothing else. Clearly, the US government intends to respond more, but how they'll do that at this point in time is uncertain. But, it doesn't seem to have forced Republican congressmen and women to change their views on this large package of military assistance that is desperately needed by Ukraine.
And just on that, what do you make of the politics of it all, General? I mean, as I mentioned, you served for 35 years in the Australian Army. Throughout that period, very often the most hawkish figures in American politics were the Republicans. And now we have not all Republicans, but a significant wing of the Republican Party blocking this and increasingly pursuing quite isolationist policies. What's your assessment of all of that?
Well, as a general, you always avoided politics, but you always needed to be politically aware. What we're seeing from the GOP now, it is not the party of Ronald Reagan. It's not even the party of George W. Bush anymore. It reflects more the politics in the United States pre-World War II, where FDR had to slowly bring the nation on a journey of why it had a more significant role to play in global security affairs than what it was in 39. So I think that's the kind of political ideas we're seeing. I don't think there's any great theory behind what they're doing other than populist policies and staying in power. I don't think there's any grand strategic design behind what the Republicans are doing.
It is true. America has always had, going back centuries, quite an isolationist streak, and I fully appreciate you are not a politician. But if you had to make that argument to convince someone in rural Midwest America why what happens in Ukraine matters to them, what would your argument be?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. If you start from the right from the top, if you allow one big authoritarian predator to prey on its democratic neighbours, they'll do it again. They'll do it in Europe and they'll do it in Asia. That will have a significant impact on the hip pocket of every American voter. The cost of everything will go up, whether it's fuel, whether it's basic food, goods, those kind of things. So there's a hip pocket excuse as well as a geostrategic excuse for why the US has a very important role to play in global politics.
If and when this aid gets approved, how long will it take to actually reach the front line?
Well, it will depend on where it's drawn from. Some of it will probably be sitting in Germany from US Army stocks, but I wouldn't expect to see it coming in immediately. We're probably looking at weeks at the earliest, but I'd be pretty confident that someone like General Brown, who's a chairman of the Joint Chiefs, would have a contingency plan to surge US Transportation Command and its aircraft and ships to Europe to ensure that aid gets to Ukraine as quickly as possible when it is approved by the US Congress.
And does that include the ATACMS? Are they relatively straightforward to get to the front line quickly?
Well, you'd think so, and it depends once again where they come from. I'm sure the US has stockpiles of these in Europe, so that may well be something that would be able to get in there rather quickly. Larger equipment and armoured vehicles might take a little bit longer.
I suppose the other key question about this aid package, 95 billion in total, huge amount of money, about 65 million of which is going to Ukraine, the rest going to Taiwan and Israel. How long is it going to last?
Well, that 60 billion really should get the Ukrainians through this year, get through to a new US administration, whoever that is. And that was the intent of having such a large package, is get the Ukrainians through 2024, make assistance not subject to the vagaries of the presidential campaign that will kick off once the contenders are confirmed. And then, it's a whole new ballgame. Once there's a new administration, they'll reassess the situation and decide whether to continue aid or not. We obviously hope that they will continue aid.
Is it your view that if it's a Trump presidency, aid will stop?
It's very hard to tell, even though there's a lot of speculation that that is the case. He may well be convinced otherwise. So I don't think it's 100% that he'll stop aid. There's a strong possibility he will. We certainly can't deny that. But, I think, he could be convinced that it's in America's interest, particularly since all that aid, most of it is being spent in the United States. It's good for American workers and American industry that this aid is being provided to Ukraine. Now, on the counter is things like US debt and those kind of things.
What about the reports that a Trump presidency could lead to the US pulling out of NATO?
Well, certainly it appears that Trump is inclined in that direction, and his most recent comments about those who don't pay their way are allowed to be subject to the predations of Russia and other countries is a really repulsive concept. I mean, at the end of the day, there is a 2% benchmark. It's not encoded in law or policy. It's kind of a gentleman's and gentle lady agreement across the alliance. But should countries be held to ransom just because in a certain period, because of economic reasons or other reasons, they're not able to meet that full 2%? I don't think so. That would be strategically immoral and strategically corrupt.
Just to pick up on those comments, though, and you're right. They were pretty outrageous in terms of inviting Russia to attack those who don't meet that commitment. But as ever with Trump, was there not a grain of truth there that actually European NATO members probably do need to spend more on defence?
I don't think anyone doubts that there are a lot of countries that can spend more on defence, including my own. But I think you've seen countries go on a journey over the last 2 years. I mean, the Baltics have been extraordinary. You've seen the Nordic nations once again offering extraordinary support to Ukraine in all kinds. I mean, Denmark just giving Ukraine all its artillery recently. And even Germany has gone on a pretty amazing journey over the last 2 years. I think hopes were raised with Olaf Scholz's speech some time ago in this regard, but their actions in the last 6 months, I think, demonstrate a Germany that at last has realised it as a threat from the war in Ukraine and potential Russian operations afterwards. And, the speech by the German defence minister at the recent Munich security conference is indicative of a changing mindset. But to go back to your previous comment, even if Germany decided it was going to set its defence spending at 1%, which is less than what it does now, that in no way would justify not defending it if Russia was to attack it. That just would not be right, and it's not how we do things as democracies.
If America did withdraw from NATO, what would that mean for the organisation? Would it still be able to be a significant defensive organisation?
The US is obviously the bedrock of NATO. It is the connective tissue of NATO. It provides many of its most important strategic capabilities, both conventional and nuclear, even though there are members of NATO such as France and the United Kingdom that have their own independent nuclear deterrence capabilities. So NATO might still go on, but it would look very different. I mean, countries like Canada would have to reassess their membership potentially. European nations would have to re-look at themselves for some of those big strategic enablers that the United States military and the United States government provides routinely that underpin NATO.
You mentioned the death of Alexei Navalny a bit earlier on. I wanted to ask you about another death in recent days. It's believed that the body of a man shot dead in Spain, near Alicante, is that of Maxim Kuzminov, who's the Russian helicopter pilot who flew into Ukraine last year, defected to the Ukrainians. What do you take from that? I mean, I suppose it shows once again the ruthlessness of Vladimir Putin when it comes to dealing with his opponents.
Yeah, I think Putin puts opponents into two different camps. Firstly, there's non-Russians, and they're to be sneered at, be the subject of misinformation, smeared, and these kind of things. But he has a special place for Russians who are no longer loyal to Russia. And there are multiple examples of the Russians under Putin killing or seriously hurting Russians who have defected, Russians who have spoken out against Russia, both inside Russia and those who have defected, like this helicopter pilot or the former Russian government agents who were poisoned in the UK. He is a very ruthless operator. He will brook no dissent among Russians against Russia.
Is there more that the West can be doing, not just in terms of military aid, but in terms of sanctions on Russia? There's conversation now in the UK, certainly the former Foreign Secretary William Hague has come out and said that some of the frozen Russian assets that were seized in 2022 when the full-scale invasion began, they should now just be spent on military aid for Ukraine, partly because that money's never going to be returned and partly because it's a way of hitting Putin in the pocket. Do you agree with him?
I do. But I also understand there are very significant legal problems with seizing the sovereign assets of another country, even if you are at war with it and you hate it. I mean, it's the top of a slippery slope. All kinds of countries might then decide they want to seize America's assets in Africa or Australia's assets in South America for all kinds of reasons. So I appreciate the legal arguments for why countries might not want to proceed down that path. But at some point, we probably need to find a way to do it legally without setting an untidy precedent internationally. I think another really important thing we need to look at in 2024 is how do we stop Western technological components finding their way into Russian weapon systems, into Iranian weapon systems, and in, as we've seen even the last 24 hours, North Korean ballistic missiles. Somehow we need a more robust regime to prevent our technologies being used against us. Now, that's not easy. If it was, we'd already have a solution, right? But we really do need to have a look at this because clearly Western technology is superior to everyone else's. It's what people want to use in their weapons. We have to stop it. We have to degrade it. We need to slow it down.
That's a really good point. And I know, a lot of Ukrainian politicians have made that point. Why is it that Western components are ending up in these weapons being used against the Ukrainians? How big a problem is it? What's the scale of it?
It's pretty significant. I think the North Korean ballistic missiles, something like 70% of components were Western technologies, up to a half of Russian weapon systems, particularly drones, and same with the Iranian Shahed drones, have Western components in it. I mean, this isn't one or two components. This is dozens, if not hundreds. There is clearly a pipeline. There are clearly on-sellers operating in a global racket to ensure that, I'm sure at a great price, that Western components end up in the hands of people that we don't want them to end up in.
I wanted to ask you, General, about the two significant anniversaries we have in the war in Ukraine this week. This Tuesday marked 10 years since Russia's invasion of Crimea. This Saturday marks 10 years since the full-scale invasion. And I wondered to what extent you actually draw a direct line between the two. Had we responded as the West collectively more strongly in 2014, would we have seen the full-scale invasion of 2 years ago?
Once again, it's one of those counterfactuals. It's very difficult to prove otherwise. But I think a reasonable person should surmise that if the West had not looked away, as it did in the wake of the 2014 Russian operations in the Donbass and the illegal seizure of Crimea, it may not have enacted how it did in 2022. One of the most provocative things to authoritarian regimes is looking away from when they act badly. When we look away, they take it as license to do it again. Or when we indicate we're unlikely to stop them, they do it and do it again. We saw that with the invasion of Iraq and Kuwait. We've seen it in Ukraine. And we need to use this to ensure the Chinese don't invade Taiwan in the near future.
I suppose that goes back to your point about the White House for too long being terrified of escalation. One way or another, maybe, escalation is coming, either led by the Russians, or maybe it's better if it's led by us.
Well, I think the Russians have made it very clear. I mean, the one thing about authoritarians which is unique to them is they tell us exactly what they're going to do. Putin told us exactly what he was going to do before this war started, with that long, crazy historical essay. He was telling us what he was going to do. Medvedev and other government ministers are telling us what they're going to do if they win this war against places like Poland, like Norway, like the Baltics and other countries. And in this part of the world, President Xi is telling us exactly what he is going to do to and with Taiwan. Why we are not able to believe them and do everything we can to deter them, as expensive as it might be, it's far cheaper than the alternative.
Just finally, General, what will you be looking out for on the front line in particular over the coming weeks and months?
I think for me, clearly I'm looking at how Ukraine resolves its personnel and munitions problems and larger production issues with things like UAVs and other uncrewed systems. But I think importantly, I'm looking at how both sides resolve a couple of really interesting operational challenges that they haven't resolved yet. Being able to approach an enemy position without being seen or without taking unsurvivable casualties. Neither side can do that at the moment. It's a problem that has to be solved. Breaching an enemy's minefields and defences and doing operational exploitation, neither side have the capacity to do that at the moment. And in some respects, it's kind of like we're in that 1917, 1918 period of World War I, where there were all these new technologies. We had a couple of years of war. we hadn't really found new operational techniques and we're searching for them. I'm looking for those kind of solutions to emerge over the next 12 months or so.
Major General Mick Ryan, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you again.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.